We hear all the time this idea that there are those of us who are predominant left brain thinkers and predominant right brain thinkers. So which one are you? And if you're a left brain thinker like me and like our guest on the podcast today, those of us who naturally identify as being analytical and logical, how do we tap into the right brain parts of ourselves, the parts of us that are more creative, more intuitive? How do we unlock and connect with those parts of us? If this conversation feels relevant or timely for you, then you are going to love today's conversation and adore our guest like I do. Today we have on the podcast Juanita Molano Parra. Juanita is an engineer, an MBA turned life and leadership coach, and she's actually someone I've known for a long time now. I originally met Juanita in Colombia when I was attending her cousin's wedding outside of Bogota, who married one of my best friends from the Peace Corps. Juanita is originally from Colombia and 8 years ago moved to the US, first to New York and then to Indianapolis. For a decade, she worked in the corporate finance space, geeking out on spreadsheets, optimizing processes, and connecting people. So, my kind of person. Now, as a coach, Juanita works with multicultural, kind, soulful business creators to cultivate an inner compass based on their values, desires, and purpose. We have a beautiful conversation about Juanita's journey in really shifting from this life of the measuring stick, right? That life where you're just connected with the next destination, the next mile marker, the next place to get to, achievement to reach, acronyms to add on to the end of your name, like how she interrupted that trajectory to make a huge pivot and transition in her career to become a life and leadership coach, and how she unlocked with the creative parts of herself, the parts of herself that have always filled her up and brought her so much joy and fulfillment. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did having it with Juanita. And let's jump in. Hello and welcome to the Prosperous Empath Podcast, designed especially for empaths and highly sensitive entrepreneurs just like you who are committed to achieving holistic success. I'm your host, Catherine Wood, Master Certified Coach, author, mastermind leader, and founder of Unbounded Potential, a boutique coaching firm for empathic entrepreneurs. I'm on a mission to bring empathy back into the world of business. Each episode will focus on achieving more by doing less through leveraging empath-friendly leadership practices, boundaries, rituals, and systems, all the while continuing to care deeply about ourselves, others, and the world around us. If you are committed to joyful living and running a conscious business, but amassing wealth while doing so, proving that you can have both in a society that tells you can't, then you are in the right place. Join me here each week to find out how. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review so you won't miss an episode. Plus, you'll find all the show notes and helpful resources over at unbounded-potential.com. Juanita, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today.
I'm so excited too. I'm a little nervous. I realized just now because I'm like, we're here.
Well, it's funny. I don't usually have coaches on the podcast. Like I have other types of service providers. So it's fun. Like, I wonder if we're going to get all coachy.
I know. We're going to go deep into the mindsets and beings. Get ready.
Well, I'd love to just kind of maybe go back to the beginning and start off by having you share your story with us and how you got to be here.
I'm from Colombia. I think that's usually where I always start because that's such a big part of who I am, of my identity, of my everything. So I was born and raised in Colombia. I'm from Bogota, so big city up in the mountains. Came to realize too late that it has perfect weather. So never fully appreciated it until now when there's winter and no sun. part of a family of five, so brother and sister, twin, me, the eldest, and part of a really big family. I'd say like really very much Latin style, more than 30 cousins and uncles and aunts and everything. So I think that was a big part of my growing up because everything was always a lot of people. Like we would say, kind of like in manada, like everything is just all together everywhere on top of each other. Like this thing of like personal space is not really a thing, which I came to realize after was a thing here. I learned that through my husband. He does need the personal space. And realized that I am really good at creating my own personal space wherever I am. And so I'm really good at adapting to spaces and at kind of like I was creating my own little bubble, even if there's a gazillion people around me, which again, just like the weather in Bogota, things that I took for granted and I thought that was a thing for everybody, but I was like kind of able to create that for myself. I went to a French school growing up, 14 years of French education, very strict, but very fun in the end. Like I think it gave me a different cultural side that I don't know if I would have gotten otherwise. I did that. I think something about me is I always did very much like very traditional paths and very step by step of what one is supposed to do and step by step of what successful young people do. And so I did my French school, which back in Bogota, it's very, it's known for its academics and stuff. And so like I excelled at the academics there, got into college. I did industrial engineer, which is something that a lot of people do actually, or like a lot of people did around me. It was fun. I love numbers, totally love numbers. I loved a lot of things around industrial engineering that are not things that I would like to work on particularly, but I think are so cool. Like operations, I think is awesome. Like the factories and how things work, like a cars factories, awesome. Bottle maker, or you go to a brewery and you see like how everything is like put into the things and then the thing is put on and like everything flows. It's just so, I think it's incredibly magical, even though it's, you know, like some people may say like it's a factory, but it's wonderful. I think those things I loved about engineering. And after that, I worked at a couple multinational companies. So again, very, very traditional. Got great opportunities. I got awesome managers. My first company was amazing. I still in touch with my managers from back then and learned so much. Got so many, yeah, I think opportunities. That's the way to say it. And after a few years, I don't remember, maybe like 5 years, 4, 6, I don't know. A few years of working, I decided to come to the US to get my MBA. Again, that was the next step in my career. Like you go, you get your MBA and then you get a better job and da 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 da. I came to NYU. Living in New York was a dream for me. I grew up watching Friends obsessively. And I got into NYU. It was awesome. I met my now husband there. I met my best friends there. It was a very interesting time because it was both exciting and I don't know what the word for it is, but like stimulating, maybe. Mm-hmm. Like it was really the first time in my life that I felt out of my shell. Because up until then, I was always the very shy person, the very quiet person, the not super social, like kind of like all these labels. And I had very taken them a little too seriously. And it wasn't until I got to start at NYU and until I remember when we started orientation, it was very easy to talk to people. And I think part of me was a little confused that like I was able, but most of me was just really excited that I was like talking to so many new people and meeting new people, and just like it really felt like bursting out of my skin.
Mm.
And so that was fantastic, fantastic experience. Um, at the same time, the whole thing was very challenging because there is a lot of competition because you are recruiting for a job, an international student. So, like getting a visa, and I wanted to stay in the US. So, getting a visa was a big deal. And I realized then that I had planned all my life to get my MBA, and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
And so okay, but for what and what comes after? And yes, I like wrote the essays and did the things, but like what came after was clear, not inspired. It just was a path that some people had traced of what you do after the MBA, but it wasn't really mine. And it was hard. Like recruiting, I thought was really challenging. Um, I wasn't the best. I didn't have the best grades. I like all these labels that I had as part of my identity, really, for so many years were not there anymore. And so all those things were really challenging. And looking back, it's interesting to see that contrast, because it really, again, like my best friends are my friends from there. My husband I met there. Like the bubbliness and connectedness that you've experienced of me now, like it really came out a lot then.
Mm.
And the challenge of everything else too. So it was a very interesting time.
That is such a beautiful explanation of a point so many people that I think eventually find coaches reach in their life, where they're so practiced in meeting someone else's expectations, in filling someone else's box, disguised as their own boxes. And they kind of have like they're on this trajectory that they think they're supposed to be on. And then they get to the end of the road and they're like, now what? And at what point do they stop meeting someone else's expectations, whether they're caretakers, their parents, societies, and start crafting their own?
Yeah.
And gosh, I mean, I have my exact same experience of that, and I knew all growing up that I wanted to be a resident assistant in college. I wanted to be student body president of my college.
Yeah.
And I wanted to join the Peace Corps. That was it. Those were the 3 boxes. I checked them all. And then I was like, now what?
There's a word that you use of like, we're very well practiced in that. And I think that's a key piece of it. And for me, it was such a well practiced thing that it's kept coming afterwards. And so, I mean, after that, at that point, around that time is when I met you, when I just moved here, and we met at my cousin's wedding. And we connected on Facebook. And I put this in because it was a little after that I remember you started your coaching training. And so I started to see these things of what you were doing on my feed. And I remember we did it and conversation, and you were sharing all these things that you were doing. And it was just something that I was seeing there, and I was so curious about. And it was just like, oh, that's so that somebody would do that. Let me go and continue to do my MBA and my thing, because that's what one does. And so after I graduated, I got a corporate finance job, kind of same traditional. I worked at a subsidiary of Amazon technology. It was fun. I mean, I was living in New York. It was good. And I think that's the other part of like that whole well practiced dynamic, is that it works, right? Like I think it's quote unquote easier to shift it when it doesn't work, when you feel like it's just you're miserable, or you're not, I don't know, there's something big that you're not getting, or some big needs that are not met, things like that. But when things are fine, well, they're fine. And so you just continue that. And it was a matter of a few years after that where something started to get a little rocked in my world, where my company got shut down. My partner had moved to Indianapolis, where he's originally from. And so we're talking about like if I should move there. And around that time is the first time that I reached out to you. And at this point, you were maybe, I don't know, 4 years in coaching.
Mm-hmm.
And I reached out because I was like, well, here I am again, kind of like a possible transition. I finished with the company I was working. I did move to Indy. What do I want to do? Or something else that I want to do that is something I want, and something I choose, and something that I really, really am passionate about. And I was at this point for 4 years stalking everything that you were doing, but not really asking any questions. And I was like, well, how does one do what you do? I remember at that point you were doing the retreats, and that was always like, it's still on my radar. I'm like, that sounds fantastic. How does one do that? And so again, I think it wasn't until something kind of like wasn't so fine that it got me to ask myself more questions and be like, okay, like how, what can be? And at that point, it was an evolution of a few years, or like a year or two of starting my coaching training. So did accomplishment coaching, starting to work with my own coach, which I realized I hadn't worked with a coach before. I had worked with somebody that said was a coach, but was more of like something different. And really starting to experience that for myself. And it was very cool because I was talking about like the factory and everything, like everything I did. And when I was in corporate, it was so much about like processes and systems and reports and numbers, but all really connected to connecting people. So like having people from different departments, different areas, being able to collaborate, share information, that kind of thing. And to make people's lives easier, right? Like, why should you have to like wait 1,000 days to get a report that you can get in 3? Like things like that, like making people's lives easier, connecting, like that kind of thing. And in a way, that's what coaching is too. It's taking me a few years to realize the connections of all that. But really looking back, it was kind of with coaching, I found ways to also do what I was doing, but more human, having people's lives better, having people connect to others, having collaboration, like all those things, just with a different tool that is coaching, that is leadership, and that I don't know. I think the humanness, human of it is what caught me the most. So I left my job. I decided to go full-time coaching. I didn't call myself an entrepreneur because that wasn't something that I was. I was a full-time coach. That's not the same. Entrepreneurs are like people that like have, like $1 gazillion. They have these great ideas. They do tech. It took me like a good year and a half to say I was an entrepreneur, which I think is funny now. And it's been now, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, maybe? No, 6? I don't know. Maybe like 5 or 6 years, maybe.
Well, let's see. We first chatted about coaching in 2014, and then you started your journey in what year would that have been? 2018, 2017?
2018. I did my training. I graduated 2019, my training. 19, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. Geez. Yeah. Yeah. So 5, 6 years. That's crazy. That's crazy. This includes pandemic years, so that's why everything feels weird, but
for sure.
But I think to the well practice that we were talking earlier, I think that practice of doing things with an external, I'm going to say like an external measuring stick or an external, I don't know if expectation, yeah, maybe expectation, an external definition, an external measuring stick that kept coming back, because where at first it was more of like, well, you do corporate, you do your MBA, like I do my CFO track, and one day I'll be a CFO. Then it was more like, okay, I'm a coach, but I'm an MBA, and so I should be an executive coach, and I should coach this because, like, that's what I should be. And I tried that, but it wasn't fun. And not for like, I mean, not that there's anything wrong with executives. It's just like, that's not what like excites me. That's not where my heart is. It's not about them being executives. It's not about the like C whatever label. So it's just been a progression of like identifying ways that in my business I'm doing that well-practiced external measure stick and assessing more and more. We're like, well, what is it that I want? What is it that I'm passionate about? What is it that is important to me?
Mm-hmm.
And that also requires practice.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I can appreciate that whenever we start a new journey or a new chapter of our life, that we often revert to those old ways of being.
Mm-hmm.
So like, the idea of identifying ourselves based on these labels or these titles or these acronyms, we catapult into a new business or a new, a new opportunity. And then we jump back to identifying ourselves by these old labels or thinking that we need to, again, meet someone else's expectation or judgment rather than just redefining our own.
Really?
It's, it's so funny because like I think about some of my most successful clients who are in the multiple 6 and 7 figures, and they start a new business and they revert right back to being like struggling with what they charge.
Yeah.
Right? It's like they have no issues charging very competitive rates in one business, and then they start a new business and they're like, am I worth this?
Yeah.
What am I doing?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that again, the balance, right? Like of the humility of starting something new and seeing what you don't know, getting curious about things to learn, curious about like who to talk to and things to make better and all of that. But at the same time, the kind of self groundness of still like, I know who I am. And what I know or don't know, what I learned or haven't learned is not a defined definition or a measure of my value.
Well, I mean, it begs the question. So how do you introduce yourself now?
Now I'm like, hi, Juanita. Nice to meet you. Now I'm very much in that. Honestly, I'm like, I'm in that transition. I'm also, I'm gonna say I'm like into astrology and human design and all these things, but I'm not like a guru about it or anything. But something that I learned is I am in my Jupiter return. So I started, my birthday is end of June. So I started last year, ends up next year, this year. But it's this whole transition, kind of like overhaul of your career and who are like your identity in your career and what you do and how you do it and all these things. And I've definitely felt it. It's been a tornado year. But things that I have confirmed that are important to me. So this is not exactly the answer of how I introduce myself. I'm like, I'm a coach. But things that are really exciting to me is work with people that are change makers. And that's kind of like a phrase or something that had come to me before, but it felt very much like a who am I to
Mm-hmm.
say. I put this on my LinkedIn, and it took me a lot to put it. I remember like I got a lot of support just to write this thing, but on my LinkedIn it says the change makers whisperer.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, it still makes me cringe when I think about it, but like from my highest and best and like what I want to do in life, like that is definitely it. Like
Totally.
what lights me up, like what really gets me excited, and excited in terms of light me up, but also excited in terms of like this matters, like this actually like makes it worthwhile that I do work, is helping people that are creating things and that are making changes, that are making the world better, however they do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, yeah,
One thing I really appreciate about your story, and I'm so glad you shared like so much of the detail of your story, because I think that it's very much a reflection of how it typically goes for so many ambitious empaths. Like, I'm sure so many in my audience can relate with this idea of just being driven by achievement, being driven by the next thing, the next tick on the measuring stick, the next place you
mm-hmm.
have to get to, the next title you need to achieve. And, you know, your background is very textbook left brain thinker, right? Like, you're extremely analytical and logical. You're an engineer, you have an MBA, like we both share that. Not the engineer part, right? But we both are MBAs.
Yeah.
And yet you are incredibly creative, like you're an incredibly creative person. You're deeply spiritual. Whenever I connect with you, I'm always just full of life because you bring so much color and vibrancy and Latina flair to life. And
Yeah.
I also am mindful that, you've really unlocked a lot of that right brain thinking, right brain creativity in your career. So how does someone who is a organizational industrial engineer and MBA, a textbook analytic and
Yeah.
and lover of logic, connect with her creativity?
So I really appreciate everything you just said, because I'll answer your question, but I also like, it took a lot to connect to those things. And right now I'm in a season, I'm taking this first quarter a lot slower, very intentionally, because I wanted to give myself space for that. Because I've seen how I've cultivated, how like I've seen how it's come up, how I've like planted seeds here and there for that, but I don't feel I've nurtured it. Maybe that's a better word. I don't feel I've nurtured it as much. And I'm doing a lot of that today. And so, like, I mean, literally today, but also like through this quarter, I think a few different things. One, the realization that everybody's creative. So I think there's a lot of stories or things that people say that are very much, I was always in finance and I think accounting is very interesting. I'm like person, I love models. And it was always like, well, if you're like a finance person or an accountant, like you're not creative. And I'm like, are you insane? Like really realizing, and like, have you ever seen somebody create a finance model that is crazy? And that's insanely creative. Like only with creativity can you really do a finance model. And so realizing that, and I'll do a plug for this. I think there's chapters of this in many different parts, but Creative Mornings is one of my favorite events every month. And they have a manifesto at the beginning, and it starts by saying, we believe that everybody is creative. And I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, meh, sure. And now every time I go, I just like kind of like stand there and I feel it. I'm like, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I think was the first step, which was like realizing, yes, we are all creative. And it comes up in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And noticing the creativity that was already there, because then I think it often felt like something additional I needed to do, and like a lot of work and bringing the external expectations, perfectionism, and all that combo. It's like, that's too much. Like, I can't do this. But if I started with what I was already doing, then it was like, oh, like setting up a system is super creative, right? Like that kind of thing. And then from there, connecting to things that I've been curious about, that I've liked, but never really went into as much. So one thing in particular is that when I was in college, actually, I was doing I don't know how you call it here, but like in my college, it was called quote unquote an option. So you did like some classes and you graduated with an option in something. And people usually do things that are connected to their career. I chose a textile design. And so I took different classes around textile design. It was patterns and like building on a mannequin clothing and fabrics and a few different like just textures. And those were my favorite classes in my entire career, which should have told me something, but I loved those classes. And after I graduated, I never did anything else with it or around it. And so something that I've started doing is taking sewing classes. My sister has been doing embroidery, and so I just started last week, and I taking some of her classes to do some embroidery. I actually have my sewing machine right next to me, and doing small things like I'm fixing my partner's t-shirts, or I'm doing a tote, or just small things like that that are fun and that kind of like get me stimulated. That is something that I found really like catalyzer, I would say.
I mean, I love that answer. That makes so much sense. It's like losing and we said we were going to talk about this at the beginning of the podcast, but like even before we started recording, like this idea of that it doesn't have to be an either or, that we don't have to live inside of this fixed way of being and living, black and white thinking, that like we can actually live and exist and thrive in the gray and the duality of it all. And I don't know if you remember this from Martha Beck's book, The Way of Integrity, and her definition of integrity. But she defines integrity as in the face of, and I'm gonna not get it perfect, but in the face of wanting to react, that we choose to be creators. So creation rather than reacting. And you don't have to have creative talents in order to unlock that. You don't have to be an artist or a painter or a drawer. Like, having creative talents is so much bigger and so much broader. That's what I hear from what you're sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think something too, and I think it's connected kind of to that definition, Kat, actually, but like I've been better at allowing myself to get kind of taken away by things. And so what I mean by that is like, I have random interests. Like my other favorite class when I was in college, which also had nothing to do with my career, was the history of physics. It was an optional thing, like one of those things to make you well-rounded or something. But it was fantastic. And the professor was great and stuff. And I love those things. I love physics. I love mathematics. I think that is also magical. And I just sometimes I think this book found me. I was telling you before, like there's all these threads that I've picked up over at the end of last year, and that I've been threading together this year. And one of those, this book, I just started it. It found me in the library. It's called Figuring, from Maria Popova. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name right, but she does this thing where she has this thing, I think it's called nitpickings or something, but she reads a lot. She connects different stories from everything, like science and philosophy, and like, and just writes and writes, and that's what she does. And this, what she has is like in the Congress Library. It's a whole thing. So I had her name in my mind from that. And I saw this book and it said figuring, and that seemed like such a funny word. And she writes so beautifully. Like you feel you're like in the book, like Harry Potter, and you just like go in it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like about physics. Like the chapters I read about like a physician, like a physician, that's not a word in English. Physicist?
Mm-hmm. A physicist.
Okay. So Johannes Kepler, and he was the one that like discovered these three laws that were like insane in the world of astrophysics. And he discovered that the things were an ellipse. It's a whole thing that I think it's very cool and fascinating. So she's telling the story of him, but also telling the story of his time, and also talking about like humanity, and also talking about culture, and then connecting that to music and connecting that to our time. And all of this in this little chapter of this ginormous book. And I'm like, that is awesome. Like, that is awesome. That makes me feel alive. That makes me feel connected to the world. That makes me feel that magic is real. Like, and allowing myself to get carried away by that, to have even grabbed the book with no purpose, no intention. Like, I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm not going to write a dissertation. I'm not going to go into literature, right? Like, but just being in it.
Mm-hmm.
That for me is that like creator, creative, like creatrix energy
Mm-hmm.
that we can bring.
What I hear in that is that, like, when we allow ourselves to be carried away by our curiosity or our intrigue or our passion or our zest for life, like you just look so lit up as you're talking about this, that we can really connect with all of who we are, all of our passions and curiosities, and our right brain and left brain duality.
Love how you put it like that, Kat, because then when you said it like that, makes me think like that applies to anything, right? Like when we're thinking about and thinking about clients, thinking about people, like they're navigating something, and maybe they're navigating a career change. Maybe they're navigating launching their business. Maybe they're navigating step up in leadership, like anything like that. Sometimes it feels hard to allow yourself that freedom, but allowing yourself for that is really what opens up the opportunities, the possibilities, the options, like just everything ahead. But it's you allowing.
Totally. I was having a chat with a friend recently, and we were talking about when people age. I think it's such a beautiful example because we all have people in our life for whom this is true. Like that when some people age, like they become more set in their ways, like more kind of like they have more of a fixed mindset. Like it is the way it is. This is how it is. And other people, as they age, like they have more of a growth mindset. They're open to new learnings. They're open to some of these huge conversations that we're living inside of our world right now about Black Lives Matter and gender identity, right? Like our older generations, like these were not conversations out loud. And so you can either have a fixed mindset or you can have a growth mindset. And I don't know if I've ever put this together for myself before, but like I think that many of us, like you and me, who are kind of textbook left brain thinkers, very analytical and logical, that we often to some degree have to fight a thicker fixed mindset because we are much more connected, to use your words, with that measuring stick of where we're supposed to go, of what path we're supposed to follow, of the next place we're supposed to get to, of the next acronym we're supposed to add on to our name, of the next title we're supposed to achieve, the next promotion, that it can be harder to slow down and to really open ourselves up to all the possibilities and to really connect with what lights us all the way up. So I love that, your journey took, 4 years from when you and I first talked to you signing up for the coach training program. Like, I always share that after I started coaching, it still took me over 2 years until I submitted my resignation letter for the federal government. Like, I tell everyone I was a slow burner, like a slow burn, right? Like, so risk averse, so safety oriented. And that's fine. Like, there are pluses and minuses of all ways of being and all ways of being entrepreneurs in the world. But when we can really come to accept our default ways of being, like, then we can be on purpose around what labels we want to fill, what boxes we want to check, and, create our own trajectory forward.
100%.
I mean, I love that we're having this conversation. I don't know if I've ever asked you, how many languages do you speak?
3. So, Spanish from being Colombian, French from school, and then English from life, I guess.
Have you ever coached anyone in French yet?
No.
Oh my goodness, you totally could.
I feel like if French is the language I practice the least because I don't really have anybody to speak with.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I watch, Netflix has a lot of French shows, so I do that. I went to Paris 2 years ago and it was awesome. It took me like a day to really get it back, but it is fun. I think it was such a big part of my life for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love that you speak 3 languages, and that triples the number of people who you may be a great coach for. If people are interested in learning more about you, where should they follow along?
I think the best place to follow along. So my website, my business is called Jump Coaching. I didn't mention that before, but it's called Jump Coach. And my website is jumpcoaching.co. So you can find me there. I'm kind of on social media, but to be honest, I'm going to take a break. But I do have a newsletter that I share every other week. And that's really the best way to hear from me. So it's called Jumpstart. You can subscribe on my website. And I think that's something that it is something that I'm really excited about, and that I'm starting to put a lot more energy, because I realize that kind of like longer form sharing is more aligned with me than social media. So I'm doing that. So you can definitely hear from me on Jumpstart, on my newsletter, and you can find it at Jump Coaching.
Love it. And for anyone who's listening who identifies as a left brain thinker and is interested in unlocking more of their right brain gifts and becoming a prosperous empath, what do you think made the difference for you in your journey? What supported you?
I was thinking about this question from the beginning, but what I realized is, I think it's what we were talking about before, is the allowing myself to be taken away by different things. And so it may be, I think also knowing how I consume best. So I really love listening. Podcasts are a great way for me to consume things. So kind of go from one podcast to another, because in this podcast, it was Brené Brown who talked about Maria Popova. So from there, I went to her, and there was a podcast on being about her. So I went then to On Being, and then there was this session on Being about foundations that has blown my mind. So really allowing those connections to happen, but following your own interest, right? Like, if I'm a numbers person, it doesn't mean I need to go paint. I can just start by learning about the history of numbers and mathematics, which is also fascinating.
Juanita, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It was so fun to chat.
Thank you so much for having me. This was very stimulating.
Thank you so much for listening today to this episode of the Prosperous Empath Podcast with me, Catherine Wood. Make sure you subscribe and leave a review so you don't miss an episode, and so more empaths just like you and me can find the show. As a thank you, each month, one lucky reviewer will receive a 60-minute coaching session with a member of our Unbounded Potential team. You can find all the show notes and bonus resources over at unbounded-potential.com. Thank you so much for listening and locking arms with me to bring empathy and prosperity back into the world of business.